In California and some other states, propositions are proposed laws that can be created outside of the legislature. If passed, these propositions become new laws or amend current laws immediately. California Proposition 98 was an important law passed in November 1988. It is not very well known due to its complexity, but it created a revolutionary reform of the education funding for pre-kindergarten to 2-year college, which is also known as PK through 14. So how does Proposition 98 work? Proposition 98, while active, uses one of its 3 tests, or formulas, to determine PK through 14 funding. The governor and state legislature decide which test to use in a particular year. Test 1 simply requires PK through 14 education to receive roughly 40% of the state's general funding. Test 2, which is generally used in good economic years, says PK through 14 education will receive money equal to the previous year, along with money adjusted to the increase of students and the growth of personal income. Test 3 is a bit more complex. To learn more about Prop 98 and its tests, we interviewed both the writer of Proposition 98, John Mockler, and the principal fiscal and policy analyst, Edgar Cabral, from California Legislative Analyst's Office.
Those were Test 1 and 2. That was Prop 98. Prop 111 added Test 3, and that said, if general fund revenues drop, Prop 98 will be cut 50 cents for every dollar drop. So even though we only get 40%, it said 50% of the cut is going to apply to schools. And then this amount would be like we owe it to you. We call it a maintenance factor. And then if revenues ever grew faster than personal income, they would have to restore it. Not pay it back, but restore it.
As John Mockler described, Proposition 98 was originally just Test 1 and 2. Test 3 was later added through Proposition 111 of 1990.
Well, I think that the reason why Proposition 111 happened is because the state couldn't afford to provide the Proposition 98 amount, either the Test 1 or 2. So they created Test 3. Test 3 is really a way so that when there's a bad economy or the state's has fewer revenues, that it doesn't have to provide that much. Otherwise, it would have to make huge cuts to all the other areas.
How did Prop 98 revolutionize California's history and affect individuals and communities? Proposition 98 was amended into the state constitution and can only be suspended by a 2/3 vote of the California legislature. We interviewed the FCUSD District Superintendent, Mrs. Betancourt, who is a witness of Proposition 98's passage and impact.
Educators, including teachers, parents, students, administrators, were all working together to ensure that Proposition 98 passed, because that was our guarantee of a stable funding source. The opposition really came from those that did not want Proposition 13 overturned or changed.
Before Proposition 98, local property taxes were the main source of funding for education. But then Proposition 13 was passed, and it limited the maximum percentage of money that could be taxed on property. As a result, education received less money. Now, because of Proposition 98, PK through 14 education is guaranteed to receive 40% of the state's general funding. This amount makes it the largest area of the state budget, the main source of funding for PK through 14 education, and a key factor in budget decisions. Proposition 98 created a revolutionary change in education by guaranteeing minimum funds, and therefore many parents, students, and schools benefited from this. Like all other revolutions in history, Proposition 98 also had its opposition.
There was talk of opposition, not much. About 3 or 4 months from the election, then a group of people, the Medical Association, the prison guards, and some very right-wing groups and anti-tax groups decided to oppose it and spent money opposing it.
Opponents to Proposition 98 reacted by arguing that because education funds were protected at 40% of the total state general fund, other areas would have bigger cuts when new mandates were added to the California budget. Also, Proposition 98 doesn't help all education. Proposition 98 protects PK through 14 education, but it does not include four-year colleges such as CSU/UC. Proposition 98 indirectly affects higher education funding. Four-year education funding is more volatile than PK through 14 because of this. One last weakness of Proposition 98 involves taxes being raised to fund a particular area of the California budget.
So maybe there are some health or social services programs that the state wants more money for. Well, if you raise the tax, sometimes you have to use some of the money for education, and so that could be a problem. Now, some of the education people will probably say that that's not a weakness because they think that when there's more money at the state level, that some money should go to schools. But I think the other issue, if you're talking about weaknesses, is that Prop 98 is very complicated, and so you have 3 different tests, and depending on what happens with the economy and the state's revenues, a different test will be the one that's operative to determine how much should go to schools.
Proposition 98 enabled the California state legislature to gain a lot of power over PK through 14 education. School districts had less control because the money was allocated by the state.
The legislature is still able to manipulate Proposition 98. So during the bad economic times, our funding source is very closely tied to the state, and so we have a low funding source when the state has a budget deficit. What's unfortunate is the legislature has been able to directly cut school district funding.
So Proposition 98 may have had some weaknesses that caused many people to oppose it. Even so, many people felt that making sure education funds didn't keep falling as it had in the years prior to 1988 was mandatory. With these mixed opinions and reactions, Proposition 98 was barely passed, with 50.7% of voters saying yes and 49.3% of voters saying no. California's education funding and the state constitution were both reformed by Proposition 98. Proposition 98 itself was later reformed by Proposition 111. Proposition 111 added Test 3. State legislators and the governor choose which of the 3 tests to use in a particular year, although the main factor determining the decision is the economy. Proposition 98 was designed to help the education system, but due to a dramatic increase in student enrollment and severe budget cuts in recent years, different sources show that California's education funding per student ranks somewhere in the 40s out of 50s. Proposition 98 alone hasn't been able to keep us from being behind so many other states. Proposition 98 was important in fixing and protecting California's education, but we believe that some changes should be made. The percentage of the state budget allocated by Proposition 98 to education may seem to be high, but the actual amount of money each student receives is quite low. Currently, California spends $7,500 on the average PK-12 student, while over $40,000 is spent on the average prisoner a year. Proposition 98 still has a positive impact, but it is not as significant as it used to be because of current budget cuts, a low funding source, and a bad economy.
We think that Proposition 98 gave the state legislature too much power over education decisions. Before, the district decided how to spend the money, but now state legislators make all the decisions regarding Proposition 98, and educators now have no say. Also, state legislators added childcare into Proposition 98, even though it is not directly related to education. Overall, we think that because of changing times, Proposition 98 needs to be reformed to help education even more.
Don't you think education is worth funding?